I'm going to be talking about properties in C# now. We're also going to be discussing the get keyword and the set keyword, also known as getters and setters. So what does all that mean? Well, let's take a look. If you followed along with the other tutorials so far to do with object-oriented programming, then this is going to make perfect sense and lead on from that. If you haven't, then I highly recommend you watch those so you're about to understand what I'm going to show you. So what is a C# property? Why should we use them? So C# properties enforce one of the core principles of OO programming, which is encapsulation. And that's just ensuring sensitive information is not accessible from anywhere else. Like when we talked about this private variable here, it's only accessible inside the class, and then nobody accessing it has any control over that, for example. So this is going to push that one step further. So I'm going to present a scenario here and show you one of the benefits of using C# properties and getters and setters. Here in this example, we've defined a video game class here. It has various variables here we can use and a constructor with 3 parameters. Here we're setting up 4 video game objects, game 1, 2, 3 and 4, and inside the constructor we're creating a video game name, the game's publisher, and a rating for the game. So let's say when our program starts, all of this data is loaded into the system. At some point later in the software, the user wants to modify, for example, the name of this game right here. They've clicked the edit button, perhaps in the GUI, and they want to change the name. For whatever reason, maybe the video game is now called a different name. So we're going to ask the user for a new name for this game here, game 1, and they're going to type something into the system. Let's say, for example, we ask them for a new name, and we can set that using the variable name here. And maybe they accidentally hit G on the keyboard, then hit enter. So what we're doing here, we're just passing in their input into this variable. No problem at all, we'll go on with our day. However, maybe this is, not a good idea. Maybe we want to kind of validate this input first. Maybe we want to make sure that the game name has at least 2 characters or doesn't contain any numerical, characters or something like that. Maybe there's some sort of checking we need to do. So this is where C# properties can come in this particular scenario. And there's lots of reasons for using C# properties, but this is just one example we're going to go through now. So what I could do in this case is that instead of setting the name variable directly, I can create a method here called updateName. And that can take in our new name from the user. And what it can do various validation checks. It can say, okay, is the new name less or equal to 1 character? If so, then we can't update the name. And we can do any other validation on the name. And then finally, we can actually update the name. So for example, what I can do here is say game1.updateName. So now rather than setting a variable, I can use a method in order to achieve this. I pass in our potential new name, which the user gives us, and then this method will either return true if it can or false if it can't, and then update the internal kind of name variable here internally within the class. And that's perfectly acceptable. So rather than using a method in this case, because what could happen is maybe we need a method to then update the publisher, or we need then another method to update the rating. But now we're using methods to update the name, for example. Well, we can still access the name itself. So we need to kind of restrict access to the name because we only want to update the name field using our new method, updateName. So this is essentially where C# properties come in, and the principle of making local variables to a class private only. So you can see in our class here, we have all these variables right here. And we have 3 public ones and 1 private one. So we've gone through one example, and I'm going to tell you now it's common practice to make all of your variables inside classes private. And that means no one outside of the class can modify these variables in any way at all. So if I access the game1 object, Now I can't access name directly, I can't access the publisher variable, nothing. The only way I can access or update the name is using our update method. And that's exactly what we want, because when the user types in some input here, we want it to go through the validation. We want to make sure the name, has at least this many letters or, various other things. And then we want to finally update it. So this method here is an acceptable solution on how to do that. And it enforces that all our variables here are private because they're sensitive. We don't want other people, accessing these and putting any old values in. And it enforces encapsulation as well, a core OO principle. But what if I told you there's an easier way of doing this method? We don't have to write a method like this for, every single time we update a variable. Maybe there's another way. And this is where C# properties come in. So I'm going to create a new C# property now. When we create a property, we give it an access modifier. I'm going to call it public because I want everyone to access our name field. Then the name is a string. As you can see here, name is a string. And then I have to give it a name. Now, when creating properties and variables, for example, these are also known as fields. The fields themselves usually and typically are all lowercase. So you can see all of these are lowercase right here. The properties themselves, they just have an uppercase first letter. And if the variables here have 2 words, then it would look something like that. Title case, for example, without the white spaces. So that's common practice. The local fields here, the local variables, all lowercase, and the properties are always capitalized at the start. That's just good practice. So once we've done this, I'm going to show you a C# property in its basic form. Now, for any time we want to update the private field name, we go through this property here. Just like when I talked about the example, anytime we want to update the name field, we use this method. Well, rather than using this method here, we're going to use this C# property instead. So anytime we want to access this local variable here, name, we're always going to use our property instead. So consider this as an accessor for our local variable here. And in order to get the variable, so actually get the value of it, it's going to return it using the return keyword. Anytime we want to set a value, then the local variable is going to equal this special keyword here called value. And that's the value being passed into this. Let's look at an example of that right now. So if we go into our main class here, and rather than using this method here in our example, what I want to do is say game1.name. This is our C# property right here. And then we can actually give this a value, like G for example. And now what is happening here, we're using the property name, but internally inside this class, it's actually going in here and setting the value. And this section right here inside this get statement, this is where we want to do this validation. So let's copy all of this right here. And then let's put these curly braces on a new line. Let's delete that for now. So what we're doing here is anytime we set this C# property, this set statement is called. So you can see here, when we use an equals sign with a new value on this C# property, internally, this set block, all of this is executed. And at the end of this, we just want to set our local variable here, name, to whatever value is passed in. So that magical keyword value I was just talking about will equal this value right here, whatever is being assigned. So anytime this property here is set, which is what we're doing, we're setting it to G, then we're doing all this validation here. So we have to use the magical keyword value, which is the value we're actually checking. So this would accomplish exactly the same as this method here. So value just replaces the name in this instance. So let's just check this out and run through it one more time. So we're giving the C# property name a value right here. So now value is going to equal to G. It could be whatever, it doesn't really matter. Then the flow of execution comes in here, and this set method is called because we're setting a value. This magical keyword here, value, is going to equal G because that's the value being passed in. Now we're checking that the user's length, the length of the name, is less than or equal to 1. If it is, well, we can't update it then, tough luck. We do any other validation, whatever it may be. And if we can finally update it, then we're going to set our private variable name, which is this, to the value which is being passed in. And that is the magic of using a C# property and the set keyword here. So we don't need a whole new method in order to accomplish this. We can use inbuilt functionality. So the main takeaway from this is that C# properties control access to sensitive information. And these items all here, all our local fields here, are all considered sensitive information. We don't want users just putting any old values in here. We perhaps want some validation to make sure, that the values being passed in are accurate, they're valid, or for whatever other reason. And then when they finally are, then we can update our sensitive and precious private variables in this case. So this is the advantage of using C# properties. So we've talked about the set keyword quite extensively. Let's just cover the get keyword real quick. The get keyword just actually gets the value of our private variable. And again, we can do various things along the way before we ultimately return it. We can do anything we want here. Just like in the set keyword right here, we can do anything we want, but ultimately we're finally going to return it out of here. So what we can do here, let's output the name of the game here to the console window. So when this line executes here, we're just outputting game1.name to the window. So you can see right here. So what happens is internally, when we actually get this value, so what we want to do is get the name of the game. Internally, this get block is being called. We can do anything we want here, any checks, any validation. We could log to a database or a file, and then we can finally return our sensitive information here, the private field, out of here, and then out to the window. So you can see the get keyword in this case controls the getting of our local variable here. And similarly, the set keyword controls initializing a value to our precious sensitive local field right here. And again, it's always good practice to have a C# property for every one of your private fields here. And by default, you should always make your local fields private unless there's some extenuating circumstance or special reason not to. So one of the other things we can do with C# properties is to make them read-only. And what I mean by that is that the user can access the private variables, but they can't initialize them. They can't give them any value. For example, let's say the publisher field, we want to make that read-only. So what do I mean by that? So for example, say if I want to get the publisher for any of these game objects, I would use game1.publisher, and that would be like read-only. I can access the information. But when I actually try and set the data, for example, setting the name, I can't do that. It won't let me. So how do I go about doing that? Maybe it's a useful thing. So what we can do here is create a new property for our publisher. So again, we have our familiar format. We do an uppercase on the P just for good practice. And then Visual Studio is helping us by, hinting what we might want to do. So that's great. I'll use that. So this is how to make a property read-only. What we do, we just do not define a set keyword at all, only have a getter in here. Now you can't have a set by itself, you always need a get, but you can have just a get, and that makes it read-only. So let's have a look at that example now. So if we want to display publisher to the screen, we can just do that, and we can display the publisher to the screen. It's no problem at all, it's going to work. So if I try and actually set a value in here, so I want to update this publisher to, anything really, you can see there's an error here, there's a red line. And if I hover over that, you can see here, property or indexer cannot be assigned to, it is read only. And that's just because we haven't actually set a set keyword here. There's no setter, so we can't actually set a value in here. So this is quite useful if you have any sensitive fields here where you only want read access. Maybe we want to read our ID field here, but we don't want the user to set it, for example. Then we would have something like this where we only provide read access to our local variables right here. One other thing we can even do is add access modifiers to our get and set keywords. So here we have our name here. We want everyone to get the name, but however, maybe we want to make the setting of this private. Only things inside our class here can actually do this. What we can do here, we can make the setter private. And that means if we try and set this name value here from anywhere outside this class, it's not going to let us. So if I go to the main file here, what I'm doing is trying to initialize the name as a value, and I hover over that. You can see it cannot be used in this context because the set accessor is inaccessible. So we can't actually set it from anywhere outside that class. And as soon as I remove that, you can see the error disappears and we can set the name once again. So C# properties are actually quite powerful, and we've only just touched on them, but I think this will be enough to get you started with your endeavors in using them. So what you should take away from this is that properties in C#, they control access using getters and setters to your private fields, which are part of your C# classes. Thank you for watching.